think there is a real temptation to be teleological, particularly with late antiquity, because of this succession of events that seem to be mapped out so beautifully, but also the sort of religious dynamics as well sort of prompt that reading quite a bit. And in relation to that, you've characterized the lack of attention to Zoroastrianism when trying to understand the inner dynamics of the Sasanian Empire, and you've also characterized the perception that Zoroastrianism during the Sasanian period was a religious autocracy, sort of presided over by a dominant clerical establishment that is quite misinformed. Can you explain why you believe this view to maybe be poorly evidenced and elaborate on whether there was a marked difference between the way Sasanian and Byzantine rulers approached religious conformity or enforced it politically? Was there, because obviously we see in the Byzantine Empire an attempt to underpin political unity with religious unity. Do we find that in the Sasanian Empire at the same time, or are we projecting Byzantine dynamics onto the Sasanians?
The simple answer is there wasn't. The simple, just to solve it, I don't think there is any evidence that there was. But the Sasanian Empire is religiously a complicated place. And that very much both influences our modern perception of it and we are influencing the understanding of Sasanian history. So I think part of this, which is not the entire thing, it's not even half of it, but part of it is our expectations for the Sasanians to have a quote-unquote official religion. So in the same way that I am disputing the existence of an official language, I also would tend to dispute the existence of an official religion. I'm not an expert on the Zoroastrian religion or any religion, really. I'm an economic historian, as you probably have found out so far. I like talking about grain prices and things of the sort. Everything else for me kind of goes around there. So, much smarter people than me, from Mary Boyce to, I would say, Albert de Jong at Leiden University, and now a lot of the younger generation, including my very good colleagues, Shervin Farid-Nejad in Hamburg, and Arash Zaini in Oxford, and Johan Vevine also in Oxford, have talked about this in a much more in-depth way. My materialist historian's take on this is probably shallower than it should be. But it goes like this. Our assumption that there was an official church in the Sasanian Empire, I don't think is supported by the sources. We usually think of Sasanian Zoroastrianism by taking on a few very disconnected pieces of evidence, greatest of which is the inscriptions of Kerdir, a late 3rd century priest who has left us 3 or 4, I'm now having a little problem counting correctly, inscription, in which he lays out a policy. He considers himself, somebody who has been raised through the ranks of Zoroastrian clergy from the time of Shapur I in the middle of the century to the time of Shapur's grandson, Bahram II, towards the end of the century, and that we can reconstruct some sort of a hierarchy through Kerdir's inscription. And then we sort of expand this throughout the entire Sasanian Empire to the 7th century, so 4 centuries later. And then we sort of supplement this or fill a lot of gaps by what we find in early Islamic Zoroastrian sources, the great, Pahlavi texts such as Bundahesh and Din Kard and Shayest Shayest and Shikand Gomanik and so many of the other ones, and things such as the law book, the law collection of Madiani Hazardadasan, all of these Middle Persian things, of a strong presence of a strong Sasanian religious elite and hierarchy. The problem with this is it just doesn't hold. Other than that, logically you could say, Khodadad is writing about himself. And my joke always is, which one of us didn't exaggerate our CV? He's writing it himself, so how much of a power does he really have? We don't have any outside evidence to support Khodadad's claims. And then we have things such as, at the same time as Khodadad is claiming that he's very powerful, where we have a very strong rival for Zoroastrianism, and that's Manichaeism, which a lot of sources tell us that at least 2 Sasanian emperors actually supported, right? At the same time that Shapur is writing on, Shapur the First in the 3rd century, is writing on his points, Mazda Yasin Bab, Shapur Shahanshah Iran and Iran ki chehraz Yazdan, the Mazda worshipping Lord Shapur, the king of Iran, who, well, his son says Aniran, who's descendant or who's from the image of God. We know that Mani writes one of his major Manichaean texts in his honor. And we have evidence that Shapur and his son Hormuzd al-Dashir, Hormuzd I, actually support Mani, right? So just put the situation exactly at the same time and try to imagine Justinian, but not at the same time, later period. Try to imagine somebody like Justinian supporting any other religion. Or imagine, I don't know, Philip II of Spain, the very Catholic king, having supporting any other religion, right? And then when you get further on, well, Mazdakism is too messy, but Mazdakism exists, at least once or so. Again, we could interpret that as, okay, Kavat's attempt at breaking the power of the Zoroastrian clergy, although we'd never have anybody, if you have the name of Mazdak, or other people who are mentioned in some Roman sources, how come we don't have the name of the Sasanian head Mobed, head priest? There is no Mobed against whom Mazdak is rebelling, right? When you have in the Roman sources, you have all of these the Christological fights. You have both sides, right? You have John Chrysostom and you have, who's the, oh my God, Nestorius? No, not the other one. Sorry, I'm forgetting my Christological characters, but we have both sides, right? We know both sides of the game. We don't have them in the Sasanian, right? And then the last Sasanian king, Khosrow II, based on all sources, and I don't think anybody doubts that, marries 1 and probably 2 Christian wives. Again, imagine Justinian marrying a non-Christian wife, or Philip II marrying a Muslim or a Jew. It never would happen. So if an empire is so closely intertwined with its religious structure, it would be really hard to imagine that its emperor not being that hard into that religion, right? So my evidential base is that we don't see a priestly class. We don't really see a Mobedan Mobed, a chief Mobed of the Sasanian Empire, right? We don't see this struggle. Of course, there are Zoroastrians in Iran. Of course, within the empire, I would even wager they were by far the majority as far as their religion goes. But there is no state religion. We cannot really think of a Sasanian state religion. The problem of viewing it as a state religion then becomes is that, first of all, Zoroastrianism is very strange and alien, right? It's not an Abrahamic religion. It's not, as Garth Foden wrote years ago, a universalist religion either. So it's very hard for us to comprehend it, to fathom how it works, and it doesn't have claims to converting anybody. So the idea that it's not interested in supersession and extending itself, again, sounds very strange. I would not call it an ethno-religion, but it's a religion that seems to know its limits, and it has sometimes expansionists. In the 5th century, we have the idea of this Sasanian general trying to expand into the Armenian territories and bring Armenians to the fold of Zoroastrianism. But it's not that sort of a religion. And it's very hard to study it because the texts are basically gate kept behind this. We still don't have a definitive edition of the Zoroastrian religious texts, whether it's the Avesta or the commentaries on it in Middle Persian and other languages, right? So it's very hard to study it. We only know a little about it. They kept it like fire, right? They have this and that and that. They don't bury their dead, right? These are the things we know about them, right? And people who know about them will tell you that most of what we think we know about it is wrong, right? And then how ancient is it? Where the Achaemenids also Zoroastrian? All of these questions that comes up. The thing that emerges is that Sasanian Empire is religiously very, very complicated. There are so many levels of religion. There are so many levels of relationship between the state and religion, whether it is Zoroastrianism or other religions such as Manichaeism, and later Mazdaism, and then Christianity, obviously, where towards the end of the Sasanian Empire seemed to be very, very closely involved with the fate of the Christian community, particularly since in the 6th century, finally, a proper state-supported Church of the East, which is Miaphysite, which is completely Christologically different than the Roman Empire and is even considered a heresy over that, emerges under the direct support of the Sasanian emperor, but with a very uneasy relationship with the Sasanian court, as we see in the various sources. And it emerges that the study of Sasanian religion is, I would say, there is a saying that it's in infancy. I would say it hasn't even been born yet. It is so understudied that it will take, I would say, decades of work before we can understand it. My hunch is part of what we are going to understand is that, and this is something that might sound a bit weird for this, we do look at a lot of connections between Christianity and Islam because they are Abrahamic religions. And of course, it's undeniable that Islam is imagining itself within a Christian. But physically, half of this is emerging in the place where Mandeans, where Eastern Christians, where Jews, and where the ancestors of a lot of religions, some of which still remain around that area, which I don't want to go around, but you have probably heard of it, and Zoroastrianism, and various things that, for example, the late great Patricia Crone called the nativist Zoroastrianism, because that's also a problem. What is Zoroastrianism? Is it only the one that has Kerdir on top of it, or everyday people, as usual, practicing their own things? All of these things also do have deep influences on Islam as a religion, as a ritual, and as a state system. But I am very ill-equipped to actually point out anything substantial on this. And my just warning is, this is a good field if you want to write your PhD thesis on this. It's ready. Take one of them and study it.